A boundary rests on the cusp of breach. Freedom meets fear in the skies. Agents without agency seek answers. Welcome to Hidden Oaks. Most of this faraway red world was not worried about what was happening. For the forests, mountains, hills, moons, and skies, it was just a distant crackle. A bit of trapped teal lightning, snapping, biting, gnawing, and gnashing the ground within this strange reality. It echoed. It shook. Then the silver of the storm vanished. A tempest clapping closed. Afterwards, there would sometimes be a leftover smell, a sharp, acidic aroma of colliding energy, but that was all. Nothing more, nothing less. Besides, there were many other dangerous creatures flying, crawling, and swimming throughout this strange place. A half-complete portal couldn't compete with its legions of oddities. The many organisms, from the smallest to the largest, would still need to feed, hide, mate, sleep, and drink. There was also the old civilization and its lost cities. They were spread like a half-buried stone skeleton through the meadowlands. They were bent, broken, and scattered in rubble piles. They weren't interested in the doorway either. They were too busy being beacons to dead souls, stories, songs, and memories. However, for the molecules around this dimensional thrashing, there was confusion and concern. They were wondering what otherworldly force was trying to reconnect and tear this reality. They were watching a door appear and heard pounding upon it, but did not know who was on the other side. If they could speak, they would have warned everyone. But who could hear the cries of their atoms? Who could answer the subatomic alarm from this realm? Living things were everywhere, but none could listen. On these ruby plains, on a long hill with silver and jade flowers, billowing on warm winds, a four-eyed beast, similar to a fox, stretched its back and hips as it gave a smirked yawn. Its fur wasn't the typical sable, but a kaleidoscope of colors. A furry light spectrum with fangs and talons. Its teeth were a yellowish pearl and oversized. It cried hungrily and dashed into the billowing grass, looking for an occupied rodent burrow for a snack. Beyond that hump of land, over another sheet of rouge dips and rises, a silver pond sat alone in the prairie. Inside of it a worm, coiled and uncoiled. It was metal, scaled and etched with writing that was legible to only a few. Its mouth was a pyramidal beak, with a triangular pit followed by a gaping gullet filled with curved blades. It watched the dirt edge of the water, waiting for the smallest or largest prey to poke its head in for a drink. Rarely did anything appear. This spiral devil was no secret. In time it would dig into a passage through a honeycomb of tunnels. Occasionally, out of boredom, it would rise up out of the pool, letting the purple sky reflect upon its armored back. It lived on instinct and consumption, but even the worm relished the feeling of wind upon its body. Far above that reflective blip of water, in the dark clouds on the horizon, a tower of broken discs and curves loomed down at the patchwork landscape. Someone roaming atop this structure could look down and see the old roads from a long, dead infrastructure. Despite the pillar having a network of roots beneath the ground, it swayed to the high winds. The column pulsed, breathed, and shivered. shedding a black chalky cloud that swung downwards hungrily to the ground. They were always waiting for new minds and eyes to corrupt under their infectious mists. Once they're embedded in brains, capillaries, and synapses, the living would become another slave to the ordinary all around. Back on the ground, a flock of double-beaked yellow birds flew opposite of the grimy living stanchions, casting a collage of winged shadows across the land. This part of the world was flatter than the rest, and distinctly more yellow. The fire grass was gone, and a silver dirt remained. Below the first layer of sediment were massive tracks. Large, jewel-edged ladders for trains and other machines to scour across, connecting city to city. Sometimes when the prairie howled right, their rattles and whistles echoed across the empty air. Until the sound. The portal was still trying, intermittently, randomly, distantly, still hammering away at the open air in snags of light and energy. 2 blue strings of raw electricity lashed wildly, trying to tie themselves into a knot, but no act of violence or force could forge them together. After a bit, their voltaic pace would slow, then silence would return to the plains. Like the phenomenon itself needed to sit down, pant, and catch its breath. Around the fissure, the red world would blink, then return to its own rules for survival and existence, like it had always done. A glance out the side window of the aircraft brought the expanse of northwestern Anoka County to Roy's eyes. It was a living patchwork quilt of neighborhoods, forest, and scattered farmland that was only interrupted by the crack running across the glass. Reflections of the sky danced in the mirrored lenses of his gold-rimmed aviator sunglasses, the horizon aglow with the first rust pink and lemon streamers of the coming dusk, faint and delicate streaks and washes of color. Ahead of and to the east of them, the clouds stretched away into expanses of gray touched with odd wavering belts of silver, where indigo and violet hues of the night lay waiting to pounce and cover the sky. Roy's glasses hid the tiredness in his face and also his coffee-brown eyes, the only part of him that hadn't gone gray with age. Much of his face was obscured when he was flying. The wide and cracked rubber strap of his headset formed tightly to his wrinkled, bald scalp. Arching out from the right earpiece like a curved black dandelion that had gone to seed was the microphone. It ended in a foam ball that concealed his lips and sat like an exclamation point below his pencil-thin white mustache. He had meticulously policed that mustache to keep it above his upper lip ever since he had been a young man in a U.S. Naval Air Wing. Old habits die hard, and many never die at all. He cast his gaze on the co-pilot's yoke. Peter's sausage fingers were wrapped tightly about its twin handles. So strained was his grip that the skin was taut across his freckled knuckles. The flesh there shined and was pale when compared to the blushed hues of his hands and wrists. This was often how Roy assessed the stress level of his students. Many times they would seem unruffled on the surface, only to buckle under the pressure of some new maneuver or skill they were to perform for the first time. Today was going to be Peter's first landing. It was the perfect day for it, really. There was no significant crosswind. There were no other planes in their airspace, according to Joel in air traffic control. But all that being the case, nothing ever made the first time any less nerve-wracking. They were making their final approach, and about 5 minutes out from touching back down on the still and solid earth. A Navy man through and through, a naval pilot, nonetheless, Roy always had preferred the water or the air to dry land. He would like to have retired somewhere other than suburban Minnesota, but Evelyn didn't want to be away from the grandchildren, and it was the least he could do after all her sacrifice. and his duty was to his family as much as to his country. After a single boring year of retirement, he realized he needed something more. He went back to the Anoka County Airport Flight School and got signed up to teach and log hours with the students as an instructor for a few days each week. Prior to that, Roy had only dabbled in the role on off days and weekends when he was still working. Getting in fun flights, as he called them, was tough now that he was on a fixed income, so this got him both in the air and earning some extra dough. Peter had been in his class for ground school. He was a college freshman whose well-to-do parents paid for that as well as his pilot's license courses. But he wasn't some yuppie jerk like some of the young students were. He paid attention, he wanted to learn, and really cared about what was being taught. Roy thought that if the young man could get over his in-flight nerves, he could really turn out to be a Class A flyboy. As he looked for tension in his student's face, he saw that what was written in the kid's death grip on the yoke was repeated there. Above the boy's acne-filled, pudgy cheeks, he could see the muscles pulse in and out as Peter clenched and unclenched his jaw nervously. The dual pitch of the little Cessna 172's engine continued to drone as he thought. It was like the plane was powered by a hive of agitated honeybees. The vehicle was old, and as the flight school's main training craft, it had seen a lot of use. Mechanically, it was a well-maintained machine, but it had its share of cracks that were patched only with a few strips of duct tape. Yet it served its purpose, and was safe for its occupants. "Have you ever looked for cloud animals?" questioned Roy. It was a technique he liked to use with nervous trainees. It allowed them to be distracted from their fears for a moment while still being able to pay attention to their surroundings and quickly come back to the instrument panel with a freshened and relaxed mind. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but it never hurt to try. "What?" came the static and semi-distant reply from Peter in his headphones. "You know, cloud gazing? Looking at the clouds and picking out ones that look like something else? Didn't you ever do that as a kid?" returned Roy. Then pointing, said, "See, there, 10 o'clock high, right over Moore Lake, there's a hippo." "Sure, I can kind of see it. And of course I've cloud gazed before. What kid didn't do that?" answered Peter with a single nervous laugh. "And over there, 3 o'clock on the horizon, a cat is marching out of the gloom. Now you find one." "That one kind of looks like a dragon," pointed out Peter with a grin. "You're right, it does," agreed Roy. Presently, the red dome of the sun swam into sight from behind the misty shrouds of a pack of cumulus clouds in the west. It set the world around them ablaze in flares of brilliant apricot and vermilion. Abruptly, the watching student saw something and started forward in his seat, though luckily not adjusting the course of the plane by accident as he did so. "Did you see that?" gasped Peter. "Where?" "There, 12 o'clock low, right in the track of the sun," he answered, pointing. The aged pilot stared in the direction indicated, and then saw the thing that puzzled the boy, and immediately the tiredness went out of his eyes and face. Something glinted silvery and white between them and the crimson-painted sky ahead. It was only visible for a moment, between bursting forth from one cloud and entering another. Roy's first thought was that it was another plane, but when they had radioed ATC, there hadn't been anyone else in the airspace. That meant it was unlikely, but not impossible. They had both seen it clearly, and it was too big and moving in a singular way, belying that it was no bird. Roy felt it was much too close for his comfort. He immediately refused to listen to his student's suggestion that they change course and bring the spot to their side windows to see if they could get a better look at whatever it was. He was a cautious man, and there were protocols to follow in the air. One slip-up could mean a lot worse than a near miss, and things happened fast when two objects hurtled toward one another at more than 100 miles an hour. But for all his caution, curiosity was not lacking in him, and he adjusted course slightly to see if they could catch sight of the thing while essentially maintaining their path. "Better let me take control for a bit, Pete. I'll let you land in a minute. I just want to make sure we're in the clear here first," said Roy, intently focused on the sky in front of them. Suddenly, Peter gave out a sharp exclamation as the glint returned, and all at once he said, with a little note of excitement in his voice, "It's back, and it just stopped moving altogether." "There, I see it too. Here's a lesson for you, kid. If another aircraft ever looks like it's completely still in the air, it's heading right for you," spat the instructor, always finding a spot to insert a lesson. Peter saw that Roy was right as he noticed the size of the thing begin to increase. It certainly looked like a plane at first, but as it grew closer, the two could see it in more detail. The wings alternated between flapping and soaring like a great blue heron or bird of prey, and though they were still distant, they could see that this thing was much bigger than any raptor they had ever seen. It was also a flickering series of gray and white opalescence and silvery shifting streaks. It had a brilliance that mimicked the polished facets of a precious gem beneath the jewelry store lights. The young man said many things breathlessly as the object drew nearer, but the pilot stopped him with a quietly lifted hand and said, "We have time. We need calm. That's how we survive in the air." And just then, right before their eyes, the flying object disappeared. The uninterrupted droning of the 172's engine filled their ears as the two sat silently for a moment. Their eyes frantically searched the sky for the thing they had only seconds ago been so startled by. As if it couldn't handle the tension, the end of a strip of duct tape reinforcing the cracked window next to Peter came unstuck and flapped twice before sticking back in place again. Roy radioed ATC, who replied immediately that they were the only aircraft in the monitored radius. They relaxed, sliding back from the edges of their seats. All was as it had been before. A single muted bounce of turbulence struck them. Peter drew in a breath as if he was about to speak, but before he could say a word, his eyes grew to the size of golf balls and looked as if they were going to jump right out of his face. In what felt like an instant, the object had reappeared closer than ever and rushing headlong toward the plane, only yards away from the propeller. They could now see finer details of the thing. It appeared to be a large, white, semi-transparent bird, a giant version of the ethereal albatross from Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Its wingspan nearly matched that of the Cessna. Anything this large striking the propeller or windshield would be disastrous. Their terrified cries came in unison as they threw up their arms in the same innate reaction to protect themselves from the crash that they knew would come. From between his upthrown arms, Roy saw the thing as it struck the plane. But no collision ever came. The moment stretched out into eternity as though that instant in time desired to be observed frame by frame. The steely outline of the soaring entity slid handily through the walls of the aircraft without doing any damage. Roy watched as, like a phantom, its lustrous body glided into the engine compartment, then out of the instrument panel before him. As it struck him and the student directly, there was an instant of static buzz that tingled its way through his skin from the point of contact and felt like it ejected itself out of every hair on his body. Then he was cascading backward. His vision continued on as though stuck to the being like a bug on a roll of flypaper dashed away in a strong wind. He saw the interior foam of the headrest as his mind's eye continued backward with the shimmering body. He saw his own body slump forward in the pilot's seat as he was carried through the back portion of the cabin and then out and up into the sky. Only for a moment did he focus on the plane as it disappeared below him in a sky that was resplendent with the myriad colors of a fall sunset. Because all at once, he experienced the feeling he had yearned for his entire life. The sense of unhindered, unmechanical, unassisted, and absolutely free flight. The sensation that he had always envied the birds for hoarding all to themselves. His point of view pivoted as if on an axis, and he looked ahead. The deepening gloom in the east only sharpened the spectacular, unimpeded view of the clouds painted in vast slashes and bars, the full array of the warm color spectrum. He was inside the sunset of a Bob Ross painting. He had never seen anything so beautiful in all his life. The visual beauty was only second to the physical beauty of the act of flying. He felt his mind spread his arms. He could feel the wind gliding over his sterling wings. He felt the warmth of the setting sun blaze across his side, and then the cool mist as he barrel-rolled himself through the reaching, wispy arm of an approaching cloud. Never had he felt so alive. Never had he felt so exactly the feeling that he had sought his whole life flying planes. The air kissed his bald head as he soared onward, and then suddenly he was drawn against his will toward the eastern twilight. Every nerve in his body sensed a sudden coolness, and his vision dimmed steadily. The soaring feeling and the breeze on his face began to die entirely away as he lost his sight. In its place came the sickening falling sensation. His stomach lurched its way into his throat, and before he lost his view entirely, he perceived one last thing. Somewhere, from across the sky behind him, there came a single tearing burst, something not unlike the crack of a whip, and he was in the dark. Roy opened his eyes. He was back in the cockpit of the Cessna. The sounds of the engine were the first thing he became aware of. The propeller was slowing and the pistons were arguing in an array of clatters and clutters before sputtering out completely, leaving only the whistling of the wind through the wing struts and landing gear. Peter was slumped over in his seat, but a fast pulse check on his carotid artery told Roy he was still alive. He was breathing, too. Not that there was much to be done about it if he wasn't. If the plane crashed, it wouldn't much matter. With the calmness of someone who had been drilled on managing a stalled aircraft dozens of times, Roy flicked several switches and adjusted the throttle without saying a word or breaking a sweat. The engine caught immediately when he switched it on. They hadn't even strayed from their course, and it only took a minor adjustment to line up with the runway, which by now was right in front of them. Roy landed, then sought awaking Peter. Peter didn't seem to remember anything. Roy had no idea how to explain what had happened. He didn't even know if it had happened the way he remembered it at all. The kid was obviously distressed by the number of questions he was asking, and before he had a panic attack and passed out again, Roy told him a quick lie. That he had held his breath and passed out when attempting to land, but that it was okay. He had seen nervousness like that happen plenty of times before. It was nothing they wouldn't be able to work through. The young man was embarrassed. Roy hoped it wouldn't stop him from flying again. After putting away the plane in the school's hangar, Roy stood on the grass near the tarmac for over an hour, staring up at the now twinkling night sky. He tried his best to recall the beautiful gift he had been granted, if even for only a few seconds. The soaring he had yearned for all his life. For once, he had been able to truly fly like the wind. Penny for your thoughts? The voice snapped Jay out of his car window stare-induced trance.
Oh, that seems pretty overpriced.
He meant it, too. Some problem solver he'd turned out to be. Ever since that day, that nightmare of a day, it seemed as though nothing had gone right. No amount of methodical thought, his only real asset, had led to anything positive. He looked over at his friend, other Jay, J2, and wondered if his joke-turned-habit naming convention based on their number of legs had put them backwards. Jay Wilker had been driving for almost 2 hours now and showed no sign of the road restlessness which J1 found himself overwhelmed with. They were both in their black suits, which only ever grew more uncomfortable as the day went on. More sunlight was hitting Wilker's darker skin, but he wasn't sweating at all. Jay rolled down his window again, trading the peaceful quiet for some moving and cooler air, which the car's broken AC couldn't provide. "Come on, you've barely said a word for days since Mystic Lake," Wilker prompted again. Jay felt a small ache of guilt, enjoying the turbulent breeze but recounting his recent behavior. He had indeed been giving his friend and roommate the silent treatment, though not on purpose. He was just so very tired. Tired of the effort, tired of remaining positive, tired of being wrong. Things will get better. They'll know what to do. The commander had a plan. She'll find a way to reach us. Wrong and wrong and wrong again. He stared out as they passed another patch of woods dense with fallen leaves. Some trees were already bare, while others had barely begun to turn, stubbornly clinging to their leaves. He wished he was better able to cling to his few remaining hopes after so many had fallen. But none of that was Wilker's fault. If anything, he'd been pulling his weight better than Jay had, at least when he was around. Where he kept going off to at night, Jay could only guess. Clearly, he didn't want to talk about it, which was fair enough. The two had gone from being apart for a year to spending what was probably too much time cooped up together. Too much time being serious. Their old gag of copying or one-upping each other's facial hair had deteriorated into both being clean-shaven agents. Jay reached into their remaining pool of in-jokes to lighten the mood, and pulled out a thick, mock Russian accent.
He's okay. I'm only feeling like you're moose and squirrel.
Agent Wilker cracked a smile, his own anxiety easing a bit. It was pretty clear where his companion was going. "This time for sure," he answered in his best dopey cartoon voice, and the duo shared a chuckle. They had caught quite a few late-night reruns of Rocky and Bullwinkle, usually following a marathon video game session. He wondered whether something as simple as an evening like that might help with the tension that had been building up since the agency had fallen apart. He'd been so focused on their last orders as agents, maybe he should have been doing more to keep his friend's spirits up. He was pretty certain Duncan was still taking painkillers, and more than he was ever supposed to. But he was family. Earned family. As much his brother as if they'd grown up together. And he'd lost a leg, for heaven's sake, not so long ago. That was the trouble, though. There was no end to it. It would always feel like he could give more, cut some more slack, be more patient. He was generous by nature, a virtue he had no wish to change, but it was beginning to feel like his well was running dry. There was no time to worry about that now. They'd been given a task. And if they didn't get Commander Mura's message to the Lower Sioux leadership, nobody would. Whatever happened afterward, he hoped, would be out of their hands. Naturally, he worried that this would only be the beginning of something harder still. His brief time at the agency, and certainly that final day, had left him with an unhealthy background radiation level of dread, day and night. He'd never been able to meet with the caretaker family. Their house was always empty. Most mornings he would wake feeling less rested than when he'd gone to bed. He was slowly being eaten alive by worry. Worry that they were being watched. Worry that Alpha Division would find them before they delivered their message. Worry that he would fail the commander. Worry that with their delays and stumbles it was now too late. Worry over 17's escape. And the whole can of worms that must have opened. Things that worried other people felt comical by comparison. The Y2K bug, the ozone layer, taxes, death.
The Worrier Warrior returns.
What? Oh, hey, that's not bad. Worrier Warrior. I like that. A grin just about landed on Wilker's face, before dissolving away. In that moment, he nearly looked his own young age. Before the tired eyes and tense brow he'd rapidly and prematurely earned reclaimed his expression. Memories bubbled to his mind's surface, stories of Agent Friedman and his proclivity for assigning catchy nicknames to people and events. Stories that were almost silly and impossible to square with how things had turned out. Stories Agent Matson had shared when he'd been the one in the driver's seat. 2 agents to a sedan. A sedan with working air conditioning. Wilker rolled down his window as well, filling the car with buffeting noise and a welcome cross-current. He wondered what sort of nicknames he might be contributing to at that moment. The 2 J's. last of the agency, grasping at straws.
Penny for your thoughts?
Duncan offered over the gusting air. Wilker decided that it was better to blurt out something honest and stupid than to carry on with the overthinking, underspeaking uneasiness that they'd let themselves fall into. Grasping at straws. Kind of sounds like a good Indian name for us. Is that racist?
I don't know. Probably. Finally, someone asked me the question instead of you.
In an instant, the atmosphere within the car brightened from anxious to friendly. Windy and noisy, but friendly. Yeah, probably. Although I got the impression the guy we talked to up in Prior Lake would have laughed and encouraged it, and then talked to us about the casino some more.
Definitely. I figured if the family at Hidden Oaks had their rituals and stuff, then whatever we're looking for with the Sioux would be related to that somehow. But yeah, he didn't seem that into tradition. Not that I was expecting to bust out a peace pipe or anything, but you know.
No, I get it. Not to mention the runaround we were put through before his name even came up.
I was going to ask, I think they took us for federal government employees of some kind, which I hope this isn't racist, but maybe that's not such a great way to get Native Americans to open up?
No, I suppose not. But I don't think I ever said...
No, it was nothing you said, but I think it's what they thought. And we did look the part.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was hoping they'd met Commander Mira at some point and would recognize that we were dressed like her, but yeah, let's leave our jackets in the car this time.
No argument here. You know, I don't actually know who we work for when it comes to it. Are we technically feds?
No, I don't know. I don't actually know either. I think it's complicated.
It's weird she gave us a who, but not a where. Lower Sioux turned out to be kind of a wide net.
True enough. Wilker had to fight the knee-jerk reaction to leap to the commander's defense, even though she would have been the first to admit how spotty and rushed her orders had been. Still, he couldn't get the last thing she'd told him privately out of his head. Of all the slain agents they'd seen on that awful day, none were from engineering. Not one dead from the lab Duncan worked in. She specifically said she had no reason to distrust him, but there it was. A nagging doubt, a whiff of suspicion that raised itself any time Duncan said anything even remotely critical of the agency or their commander. It turned his stomach that he could think such things about his best friend and only remaining ally, even just for those brief moments. As he checked his notes and they pulled in onto the cracked pavement toward their destination, he found himself mildly surprised once again. He didn't know what he had expected, but neither the grand modern office back in Prior Lake nor the much more modest brick structure before them were it. This time, at least, there were no clusters of cigarette butts dotting the parking lot. Duncan had to pause and smile when he spotted the address as they entered. 39527. It was one of those curious numbers which felt very strong and symmetrical, almost even, although most of its odd number of digits were themselves odd. Duncan had long since given up mentioning observations of that nature, even with a friend as close as Jay. At best, he would be met with confused indifference, and at worst, thought mentally ill. The number still gave him a feeling of wonder, and even hope. The young men were kept waiting outside the main office for a little while before a short man emerged and gestured that they should enter. As the Jays approached, they got a better sense of the man's bulk. Beneath his pressed shirt was some muscle mass. His hands and skin showed enough wrinkle to suggest middle age, but his face revealed nothing at all. Inside, a much older man behind a desk stood for just long enough to point his hand at the pair of chairs facing him, then slouched back into his own seat. The office was adorned with banners and carvings, patterns, and relics. The short man closed the door behind them. A curious, faded tapestry caught Duncan's eye. It looked very old, but the figure at its center seemed somehow familiar. Not wanting to stare or seem impolite, he returned his eyes to the elder and sat down. Duncan's false leg caught awkwardly against the chair and required some minor fidgeting. His first prosthetic had been a better fit and less clumsy overall, though if he was going to wish for a previous leg, he'd have had to go with his original. The 60 hertz buzz of fluorescent lights brought a plainness and familiarity to the office, though it also held a smell he couldn't place. It was perhaps some relative of potpourri that lit up fragments of a memory he couldn't pin down. All things to keep completely quiet about, he told himself. It was better to let J2 do the talking anyway. Hello, and thank you for agreeing to see us. Wilker extended his hand across the desk to shake with the old man. Elder, president, chief, he still wasn't sure how to address him, so his plan was to be as respectful as possible without doing so. Whatever his proper title, he made no motion to meet Jay's hand. The muscular fellow assumed his place standing beside and slightly behind him, looking equal parts bouncer and literal right-hand man. His expression remained stone. Wilker turned to see Duncan seated and followed suit. After a bit of uneasy silence, he continued. My name is Jay Wilker, and this is my associate and friend Jay Duncan. It's a privilege to meet with you. The silence resumed. The elder had nodded gently in acknowledgement of their introduction, but made none of his own in return. The Jays exchanged a quick glance. Duncan felt as if he should speak, while also feeling that he should keep his mouth shut. Eventually, the quiet got the better of him.
This is an amazing office. So many beautiful things in here.
He cut himself off before babbling any further. At least it had come out positive and complimentary, if not particularly eloquent or helpful. After another long pause and short glance, it was clear Duncan was tagging out. Wilker had figured he'd be doing most of the talking anyway. I'm hoping you might have previously met with our colleague, a woman named Mira. When he spoke her name, he thought he caught a glimpse of recognition in the elder's eyes. Duncan saw it too, and his already racing thoughts spun into the term poker face, then wondered whether that was racist. He questioned why he felt so anxious in the first place. He didn't normally have this reaction to authority figures. Behind his own stray thoughts, he could hear Wilker explaining that they had a message from Mira and how she wanted it delivered in person. Was it guilt making Duncan so nervous? He was the only white-skinned person in the room, and previous generations of white-skinned people had been unconscionably cruel to those with red and black skin. He didn't normally think about things like that, and it was a truly inconvenient time to start. His scattered, erratic thoughts began to focus and align, all centering on the tiny parcel in his right pocket. 2 little miracles which could melt away things like pain and worry and guilt. 2, the most necessary of numbers. They were wrapped in a tissue. He'd practiced this. He could need to blow his nose and have every reasonable reason to pull a tissue from his pocket. Blowing his nose wouldn't be impolite. It was biological. Everybody had to do it sometimes, and nobody would look directly. He could do it. While wiping up afterward, just the slightest sleight of hand would be all it would take. A quick, innocent swallow and it would be done. The room had grown silent, yet again. So much silence. What if one or both pills were to drop? He had practiced, but never mastered this particular maneuver, and he'd certainly never tried it in close quarters with everyone facing one another. Duncan's deliberations met an abrupt stop when the elder finally spoke.
You came here to say something. What is it?
It was a simple question. He had not acknowledged knowing who Mira was or given any indication of what he thought of the boys before him. The Jays shared one more glance, silently agreeing that there was nothing to lose, and Wilker answered, Wendigo has escaped. The room fell silent again, though not wordless. The words were hung plainly in the air, formless. Wendigo has escaped. A message, a warning, a trigger. The elder had no reaction. The other man's expression, as ever, did not change. Wilker remained patient, but the absence of feedback led him to worry. Is there anyone else we should talk to? Anybody who might have met with Agent Mira? Of course, we don't want to waste your time." Before he could finish, the muscular right-hand man spoke. "Agent?" Wilker's heart sank. He'd blurted out something honest and stupid.
Are you two with the U.S. government?
Another simple question. The room's atmosphere had darkened from uncomfortable to hostile. The two young men for once did not glance at each other. Wilker hadn't answered when directly asked. He wasn't going to say another word. So it fell to Duncan, who decided to spill everything he knew.
It's complicated.
The elder did not appear to agree. He sat back, folded his arms, and drew a full, slow breath. His gaze drifted upward, and his eyes closed while he exhaled. When he opened them, he spoke softly.
It's time for you to go. You've delivered your message.
Do you know what it means? Did Mira...
Duncan did not finish. The burly, stone-faced man walked by curtly and opened the office door. The discussion was ended, and it was indeed time for the pair of young men to go. They stood, nodded politely, and made their way out. Matto closed the door behind them, finally relaxing his posture to a degree. He turned to his elder, and finally allowed a question to ever so slightly shape his face. Just as his mouth opened, the sound of one of the unwelcome guests loudly blowing his nose filtered in. After their footsteps faded away, he began again. "Do you know what they were talking about? I don't remember any Agent Mira."
It's been 11 years. How about that? I did meet her once. Shorter than you and just as intimidating. My first thought was that she was crazy, and if she's thrown in with these two, maybe I was right.
"And who's Wendigo?"
You know Wendigo, from the old tales.
Matto didn't know how to respond. Monster stories, legends, fiction. He looked for any hint of a joke on his elder's face, but found only grave concern. If he hadn't known better, he'd have thought he was beginning to panic under his layers of calm wisdom. Slowly it became clear that he did not know better. He had never seen the old man so completely unnerved.
I know what they meant, but the truth is much worse. What has escaped is no longer Wendigo. What it is now can have no name.
The Hidden Oaks podcast is a collaboration between Patrick W. Marsh, Robert Don, and Owen Swerkstrom. The story On the Red Plains, written by Patrick W. Marsh. Lift by Robert Don. The Message by Owen Swerkstrom. The voice of Hidden Oaks and Agent Wilker, performed by Robert Don. The voice of Agent Duncan, performed by Philip Iliff. The voice of The Elder, performed by Owen Swerkstrom. Original music composed and performed by David Schwartz. Find more of his works at dtschwartz.com. Produced by Robert Don, Owen Swerkstrom, and Patrick W. Marsh. You can find out more online and purchase cool Hidden Oaks merch by visiting us at hiddenoakspodcast.com or by finding us on Twitter at Hidden Oaks Pod, as well as Facebook and Instagram at Hidden Oaks Podcast. Hidden Oaks is an Ironfield independent production and part of the Pizza Rice Podcasting Collaborative. Thank you for listening, and until next time.